Hi boys and girls, welcome to Storytime with Mimi. Today I want to share with you the Easter story, and it comes from my favorite book of all. It's a book I read every day. It's the Bible, and it's a true story. And it's the reason we celebrate Easter and the reason we have hope even in this time in our world. And I'm going to use these eggs in front of me to help to tell the story. The first one is the blue egg, and inside it is a little metal coat, donkey coat. Jesus sent his disciples into Jerusalem to go get a donkey to ride, and the people heard he was coming. And so they made kind of like a parade. They threw down their coats and they waved palm branches and celebrated because he was riding in as a king. And they wanted a king. They were being oppressed by the Romans who had taken over their government, and they wanted a king. And they thought, okay, he's going to come and he's going to make everything right. But that wasn't what Jesus meant. He wanted to be a kingdom. His kingdom was not of this world. The pink egg is next, and it has 3 silver coins, which represent the 30 coins that was given to Judas. Judas was one of the 12 disciples, and he had been with Jesus, but he was unhappy. Jesus was not doing things the way that he had expected. And so he went to the people, to Jesus' enemies, the religious leaders, those who were jealous of Jesus. And he went to them, he said, "What will you give me if I show you where he is?" And they said, "We'll give you 30 pieces of silver." So he said, "Okay, I'll show you where you can find him." This light purple egg is next. And it's a little cup. When Jesus came into Jerusalem on the donkey, they went to an upper room, and he had a Passover meal with his followers. And he even said, "One of you is going to betray me." He already knew. And they said, "Who? Well, not me, not surely. I wouldn't do that." And he said, "It's the one that I give is dipping in this cup." And he handed it to Judas, but the others didn't understand. But he told Judas to go do what you must do. And Judas left. The others thought he'd just gone to go give money to the poor, since he kept the money pouch. And Jesus told them, "When you drink this cup, I want you to remember that I'm going to bleed and die for you. And when you eat this bread, I want you to remember my body that's going to be broken for you." So nothing caught Jesus by surprise. He knew what was happening. He knew that Judas was betraying him. He knew that this was his last meal with his disciples. They didn't take his life. He was giving it. And then the orange egg has some praying hands. After they had the last meal together, he said, "Come with me to pray." And they went out to a garden, the Garden of Gethsemane, and he said, "Stay here and pray with me." And he prayed, and he asked God. He surrendered his will to his Father's, and he said, "If there's another way, let this cup pass from me." And he was in such distress that he sweated blood. He was so stressed out over that he was about to have the sins. Think of all the horrible things in this world he was going to be taking our punishment. And so as he was praying, he went back and he asked his followers, they had fallen asleep. And he said, "Can't you even pray for 1 hour?" And so he said, "Get ready, here comes the betrayer." Well, sure enough, here came the religious leaders and a group of soldiers, and they took him to the chief priest, and they were trying to find some reason to accuse him and find him guilty so they could put him to death. And they took him to Pilate, and he was the governor, the Roman leader, and Pilate couldn't find anything wrong with him. He said, I don't find anything wrong with this man. He hasn't done anything worthy to die. But they kept saying, crucify him, crucify him. And so Pilate, thinking that he could just give him a beating and then they would let him go, he had him beaten. And he was beaten with a whip that had 9 straps and had sharp things on the end like bones, that when they raked it across Jesus' back, it would tear his skin. And Jesus let them do it. He could have called 10,000 angels, but he took that. He was beaten, just like the prophecies had said, that he would be bruised and wounded for our sins. The next one is the yellow one. After they had beaten him, they still insisted that Pilate crucify him. And Pilate wanted to he was a crowd pleaser. And even though he knew it wasn't right, he said, okay. And the soldiers took him into the governor's palace, and they beat him, and they made a crown of thorns and pretended to bow to him and say, tell us who hit you. They blindfolded him, and they spit in his face, and they pushed this crown of thorns on his head and made fun of him, with mocking him. The next one is this bright yellow. Then they made him carry his own cross, and then another person was helped to carry it. And they nailed him, and it wasn't nails like we have today, these big spike. They nailed him to a cross. And they nailed 2 criminals on either side of him. But they nailed him to the cross and then lifted him up. The soldiers had his cloak, and instead of splitting it up so it wouldn't be worth anything, right while Jesus was up there on the cross suffering, they played a game to see who could win his coat and keep it. Jesus hung on the cross for 3 hours. And at noon, in the middle of that day, it turned dark. And then by 3 o'clock, he had died. And the soldiers, to make sure that he was really dead, put a spear through his side. And out came water and blood, which meant that he had already died. Even one of the centurions, the leader, the commander of the other soldiers, when he saw what had happened, how the sky turned dark and how Jesus said, forgive them for they don't know what they're doing, he said truly he was the Son of God. This next one is having trouble opening it. This next one is a piece of cloth, and there was one of the leaders, the religious leaders, but he had been quiet about it. His name is Joseph of Arimathea, and he went to Pilate and said, can I have Jesus' body? And they took his body down off the cross. And since it was the day of preparation for the Sabbath, he had to hurry. He and Nicodemus wrapped Jesus' body and used spices like they used when people died and they buried them. And he took him to his own grave that was cut out of stone, and wrapped him in the linen cloth. And this pink egg, after they laid him in his own tomb that had never been used, he rolled a huge stone to block the entrance. And the leaders, religious leaders, went to Pilate and said, now he said that he might die and come back in 3 days. And it'd be just like those disciples to lie and hide his body and say that he came back to life. So Pilate had soldiers stationed outside the tomb, and the ladies, his close friends, Mary's, were there when they followed, and they knew where Joseph Arimathea and Nicodemus put Jesus' body, and they saw the stone that Joseph put in front of the tomb. Well, then that was the preparation day for the Sabbath, and then on the Sabbath, which was Saturday, they were not allowed to do any work. And so the women went home and stayed home on the Sabbath because they weren't allowed to travel or do anything. And they got some spices ready to come back in. So early on Sunday morning, they came back with their spices, and they saw that the stone had been rolled away. And they were concerned, like, what happened? And then they saw an angel and said, why are you looking for the living among the dead? He's not here. He rose, just like he said he would. And so when they got to the tomb, this is what they found. It was empty. The grave, the tomb could not hold Jesus. And Jesus was alive, just like he said he would be. And he had conquered death. And he's told us he's gone to prepare a place for us. And he's there and coming back to get us someday soon. And that's why we have hope. And that's why the Easter story is the best story of all. And until next time, boys and girls, happy Easter.